Today, I'd like us all to just have a moment of silence because correct biomechanics is no longer with us. Something has hammered the last nail in that coffin. It's a 75-year story, the part that I'm going to be talking about. Saying there's no correct biomechanics, no optimal biomechanics, no one ideal biomechanical technique, in no way then means that nobody cares about biomechanics, that biomechanics doesn't matter. So that's not what we're saying, so just let's get that out of the way. All right, here we go. The OG of biomechanics, Nikolai Bernstein. Now, if you haven't heard of him and you have studied biomechanics, that's a tragic failure on the part of our education. He is the originator of the entire, what was then a new domain and discipline of kinesiology. And he is thought to have coined the term biomechanics. He came up with this, at the time, the first really high-tech motion capture to study movement called the cyclograph. And this study, most of you probably heard about, where he's looking at expert blacksmiths. He found that expert movers, not just with blacksmiths, but that was one of the first studies, that expert movers are highly consistent in achieving the result that they want and hitting the target. In this case, striking the hammer in exactly the right spot, but quite inconsistent in how they get there, in how the joints work together to compensate for one another. So joint synergies. And this, of course, led him to this phrase, which I think is one of the most important phrases in all of motor learning, which is repetition without repetition. So now, given that this was the start of biomechanics, it's amazing for the next 75 years, most of what we think of as traditional learning says, no, you need repetition after repetition. This repetition without repetition, this wasn't talking about, cross-training or having a lot of variety in your training. This meant every single repetition of the same exact movement. So, of course, we'll come back to that, but that's where it began. He also came up with this thing named the degrees of freedom problem, which was also then labeled Bernstein's problem. Given that the human body has this massive possible number of anatomical, kinematic, neurophysiological ways to move the body, all this redundancy in the body to produce even the exact same movement, how does the body choose? No human on Earth, with all the computing power that exists on Earth, would be capable of doing that. Because even within the lawful movements that the body could make, more possible ways to move the body than atoms in the known universe. The next stop is the 1940s to the 1970s, and this is the power couple. James Gibson, also called J.J. Gibson, and his wife Eleanor Gibson. I read this book quite a long time ago, and this is Eleanor's Principles of Perceptual Learning and Development. And this book became extremely important to me, which I'll talk about a little bit later. James Gibson, he did a bunch of stuff, including the ecological approach to visual perception. So his focus early on was on perception, especially visual perception. James Gibson introduced the term and the concept of affordances, and that's going to become really important later. Then we have, in 1978, Michael Turvey. He was also grappling with Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem, so he was interested in coordinative structures. He is one of those giants on whose shoulders so many of today's skill acquisition people, sports scientists, stand on. 1980s, we have Carl Newell. Also extremely influential, his work, and then continued on. So he kind of came up with the idea of the constraints-led approach. The 1990s, huge explosion now of motor learning breakthroughs in all sorts of ways. But I'll come back to him in 2005. Then we have 1998, Gabrielle Wolf. At this point, her work on focus of attention has become the most robust findings in all of motor learning research. She was really the first person to demonstrate not only the differences between an external focus of attention and internal, but the massive advantages of external focus of attention for most things. And not only are there advantages, but these advantages cross every time scale. External focus is one of the only things that can give you real-time performance gains, like literally right in the moment, but also later retention and transfer. Now we have Wolfgang Schulhorn. Forgive me if that's a bad pronunciation. He created differential learning, but we'll come back to that near the end of this. 2000, Kenneth Stanley is really getting warmed up on evolutionary algorithms and neuro AI. So he's one of the leading artificial intelligence researchers, and this was when he was really getting started. 2005 to 2006, Keith Davids and colleagues, they have not stopped. They combine and synthesize two different science domains, ecological psychology and complex dynamical systems. And you get ecological dynamics. They also started talking about and researching movement variability. And this book, for example, has so much research on movement variability. Although, again, just getting started. So much more came after this. Meanwhile, in 2005 and 2006, I launched a computer science book series based on Eleanor Gibson's work. It became the best-selling computer book series in all of Amazon's history, and 5 million total copies sold, 2 million of just the first book. And the reason I mention this is because I didn't write a particularly good book, and neither did my co-authors. The science is that powerful that even without being particularly good at what we were doing, the science of learning that was embedded in those books was such an unusual breakthrough because of the success, and it was so outsized compared to anything that had gone before it. I was asked then to go all over the world for the next 10 years talking about this. I opened the South by Southwest Festival one year. I was in all kinds of business and software development, product. I spoke in Washington, D.C. on how to get citizen engagement and how to help educate citizens. Google, Microsoft, Amazon. I gave a workshop on learning to the computer science faculty of Stanford. All of this stems, for me, back to Eleanor Gibson's work. 2007, Chow and colleagues come out with the phrase nonlinear pedagogy. One of the things they came out with in 2008 was this book, Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, a Constraints-Led Approach. 2010, Keith Davies and his colleagues, they just keep kicking ass. The constraints-based approach to motor learning, implications for a nonlinear pedagogy in sport and physical education. This was for a book chapter in a book, Motor Learning in Practice. Mark Latache. He puts his own spin on Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem, the bliss of motor abundance. And if you're familiar with my work, then you know that I will often say, we are not biomechanically correct, we are biomechanically abundant. Well, this is where it came from. He also wrote, in 2012, this book, fundamentals of motor control. 2013 to 2014, Ken Stanley and Joel Lehman, they start really accelerating some of the most fascinating things that first caught my attention was this bipedal walker. Have one of them be reinforced for anything that was getting it closer and closer to walking. Then they took another one, same exact simulated robot, and said, we're going to reinforce you for novelty. So this one is not rewarded for walking or taught to walk or shaped to walk. It's only rewarded for novelty. But the other one is rewarded for walking, basically taught to walk. Well, which one actually does a better job? So here they go. These two guys are walking. Just look at it for a moment and tell me, which one do you think is a better walker? Of course, the one on the left was the one reinforced for walking. It had a goal, an objective of, let's learn to walk and then walk far. But when you see it walking, you realize how fragile it is. It's walking, but it's fragile. The one that's like moving like a mofo, that one was never taught to walk, never told to walk, never rewarded for anything that looked like walk, but it was rewarded for novelty. And that's a huge clue to what happened next. 2013 to 2014, Craig Liebenson, who is often called a godfather of functional movement. Some people call him the godfather of functional movement. He literally wrote the book, Functional Training Handbook, and he was hugely influential in all things functional movement and corrective exercise. Now, let's jump ahead to the big year. I think this is my favorite year, looking back. So 2015, Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman, they're now have created novelty search algorithms, which had themselves evolved, and they discovered some things about the world. The subtitle of this book is important. The Myth of the Objective. Also, on the cover of Nature, they were studying how can we make robots that can adapt like animals. So if this six-legged robot is, out in the field in a really dangerous area, combing through rubble, looking for survivors, whatever, and a brick drops on one of its legs, it can't possibly try to diagnose what the exact nature of the damage was, and even if it could, it would have no idea how to repair it. So they said, well, how do animals do it? How do humans do it? How do any mammals do it? They manage, they adapt. Meanwhile, we're trying to make animals and humans move more like machines, and the guys who are studying and creating robots are saying, we got to study how real creatures do this. And they come up with something, and it's absolutely amazing. So, spoiler alert, it has to do with exploration and possibilities. What else happens in 2015? Oh, the OG podcast for all things Ecological Dynamics, Rob Gray. He starts this podcast in 2015, and about, roughly 3 months after the podcast launches, I'm searching on Google for, like I always did, Gibson plus perceptual learning. And suddenly I find there's a new podcast. I'm just so excited. And so I click into the podcast. I just happened to choose that one because it was the one where apparently Gibson is mentioned in the transcript. So yay. And I'm listening and I'm fascinated. I'm loving everything, that Shawn is saying. What a fantastic perspective. And he's applying it to physical, training and sport performance. And he's talking about football, American football. So I think, well, God, that, I'm still thinking computer science. That's what I was working on. But he's doing this with football. Well, that's awesome, right? And then I realized, actually, they're not talking about Eleanor Gibson. They're talking about James Gibson, her husband, who I knew almost nothing about his work. I'm so excited about the stuff he's doing that I just kept listening, and then it exploded my whole world. And at that moment, my two worlds at the time collided. So I'm over here doing my computer science work with perceptual learning. And then, of course, the horses are my passion and my hobby. I have not been and never will be a professional horse trainer. When I find out that this is something I can use and that there's an entire science domain around it and a community of people all over the world coaching every different sport, and then also chiropractors and physical therapists, people talking about it in rehabilitation, I'm so just blown away. So I get on a phone call with Shawn Myszka. This phone call lasts for 2 hours, and it changed everything about the trajectory for me after that phone call. And the most fascinating thing to me, and what I had so much respect for, is that before he made this huge shift, he was already very successful using traditional approaches. But the thing he said, he calls it his Robert Frost moment, was the moment when he realized that his athletes, his fantastic athletes, were not successful out, on game day because of what he was doing with them. They were successful in spite of it. And he said they were so adaptable, they would have been successful, but he knew deep down it's not because of the sexy drills I'm doing with them. That they were, of course, getting better on the drills. But then he would see other athletes who would get fantastic at the drills and it didn't show up in the game. So he started to make a massive change. And now, of course, he's one of the leaders in this field. Then in 2016, Dr. Nicholas Stergio does a TED Talk on movement variability. I've been recommending for the last 9 years that everyone should just go watch. This talk is very accessible to anyone. Of course, the field, including his work, has progressed since those 9 years, but it's a great talk. 2017 to 2018, we'll just put a little bookmark in the title of this paper called The Myth of Optimality in Clinical Neuroscience. Greg Lehman, 27 to 2018, I don't know exactly what year it was. He does an amazing and hilarious and breathtaking talk at the San Diego Pain Summit, and it's titled Reconciling Pain Science and Biomechanics. I'll come back to that. 2017 to 2018, remember I was already a fan of, functional training, Craig Liebenson. I'm doing some chores and listening to a podcast. I listened to the whole thing, and it's wonderful. And then toward the end, somehow I think they were talking about mistakes, and Craig says, yeah, there's a mistake I made. And then he said basically this, which blew my mind. The mistake I made for 99% of my career was correcting and telling people how to move. So just like Shawn, here's someone who was very successful using traditional approaches, but yet was brave enough to say, you know what, we've changed. The world has changed. What we know has changed. There's another way to do this, even though it's a big drastic change, which, by the way, he's now very successful doing. So 2018 to now, huge explosion of research, just near exponential, because so many people are now embracing these ideas, and some of the ideas have become so mature that now lots and lots of people wanted to experiment to poke the edges, people who were perhaps very unsettled by the research and said, no, that can't be right. So the research now often is heavily supported because so many people have tried to find all the boundaries and edge conditions of these kinds of things that have come out of ecological dynamics. So the research has now made its way into almost every topic: injury risk, rehabilitation, learning, beginners, all the way up to very elite performers. 2021, big year, because Rob Gray finally writes his book, which you should all have. It's called How We Learn to Move. Then he came out with 2 more books, Learning to Optimize Movement, which I don't have here because I listened to that on audio. And then the third one, the most recent one, is Learning to Be an Ecological Coach. I, of course, recommend all 3. But everyone should get the first one. And then 2025, now we're here. All these different domains, look at all the different science disciplines that I mentioned. Which one put the final nail in the coffin? Who went up against biomechanics? Well, we're going to do this in two memes. So if you come for biomechanics, you better not miss.
Coming from inside the house. Do you hear me? It's coming from inside the house.
So who took down correct biomechanics? Biomechanics.
What I often say is, it's not the pain science or the neuroscience that challenges these biomechanical ideas, it's the biomechanics itself, right? And if you know the biomechanics well, you can really see the holes in the common arguments. Greg
Lehman has his master's in biomechanics. If you're not familiar with differential learning, it is literally, it's the most nonlinear of all nonlinear pedagogy. It is the polar opposite of there is one ideal correct way, and that's what you should practice and get better at. It turns out Wolfgang Schulhorn has his PhD in biomechanics. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, the biomechanists are the ones who are saying there's a huge problem with this idea of the ideal and efficient and one technique and correctness. Dr. Nicola Stereo, who did the TED Talk on movement variability, yes, he's the head of the biomechanics lab. So what began in the 1930s with Nikolai Bernstein, the OG of biomechanics, then we come to 2025, and I read a paper just a few days ago, that's why I'm making this video, that was the first, and so far only, academic research paper that had ever brought me to tears. It's like I'd waited my entire life for this. And it is the most scathing, science-based, really, heavily researched academic takedown of the idea of optimal biomechanics. And of course, it comes from a leading lab. We'll probably not get his name right. Madhur Mangalam, again, PhD in biomechanics, Division of Biomechanics and Research Development, Center for Research in Human Movement Variability. For me, this was the nail, the last nail. The myth of optimality in human movement science. And it's absolutely astonishing. So I'm going to play this this is just a little screen recording of me, just so you kind of get a flavor. I don't think you can read it like this, but you can look it up. This gives you a flavor of the paper. And it's not a short thing, but I'm going to read you some pieces from it. The pervasive allure of optimality. The optimization paradigm in human movement science represents not merely a methodological choice, but a profound epistemological constraint, one that systematically blinds us to the authentic nature of biological systems by recasting the messy reality of emergent adaptation as a mathematical veneer. The persistent gap between optimization models and biological reality is not a failure of measurement precision or mathematical sophistication, but rather a profound ontological rupture. I love that phrase. A profound ontological rupture at the very foundations of our theoretical enterprise. Nature does not solve for optima. Who else said that? Oh, yeah. 2017 to 2018, remember Holmes and colleagues, The Myth of Optimality in Clinical Neuroscience, and these guys. Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. Remember, the subtitle is The Myth of the Objective. The Cartesian approach presumes that complex systems can be understood by breaking them down into simpler parts, analyzing those parts in isolation, and then reconstructing the whole system through linear combinations of these parts, which is what most people think of when they think of a biomechanics approach to movement. Biological systems exhibit emergent properties that arise from nonlinear interactions among components, properties that cannot be predicted by studying the components in isolation. Global optimization is impossible, and evolutionary path dependency fundamentally contradicts optimization frameworks in human movement science. Everywhere you see human, replace it with horse, because it's the same. No max min in a fractal landscape. I won't go into this detail because you might not all be familiar with really understanding fractals and fractal variability. There'll be a little bit about it if you watch Sergio's TED Talk on movement variability, on how variability follows a fractal pattern, just as other systems in the body, like heart rate variability. So if not optimal, well then what? The liberation from optimality frameworks opens not just new methodological possibilities, but entirely new conceptual landscape, one where variability is no longer noise to be filtered, but the very signature of adaptive potential, where stability emerges not from rigid control, but from flexible exploration, and where performance is measured not by proximity to some hypothetical optimum, but by the rich contextual repertoire of functional possibilities available to the system. The challenge before us transcends methodology. It demands nothing less than a revolution in how we explain living systems, abandoning the seductive mirage of optimization for the profound recognition that biological reality emerges from a crucible of contingency, scale, and contact that no optimal solution could ever capture, nor any reductionist framework predict. Scientific theories often reflect the cultural metaphors and intuitions of their time, shaping how we interpret and explain natural phenomenon. The myth of optimality in human movement science exemplifies a broader pattern in scientific history, the tendency to project our human design intuitions onto natural phenomenon. Possibilities grounded not in idealized mathematical optima, but in biological systems' rich, complex, and inherently variable nature. By embracing this complexity rather than reducing it, human movement science can develop more robust, accurate, and helpful frameworks for explaining how humans move, adapt, and learn. And remember, when you see human, you can replace that with horse or literally any mammal. Okay, we're at the end. Correct biomechanics had a nice long run. It really did. But its day is over. It should have been over a long time ago, before it even started, but here we are. So when someone says, as they've been saying to me for more than 10 years, relentlessly, but that's not correct biomechanics. And biomechanics is just a fact. I mean, it's just anatomy and functional anatomy. Well, tell them that's not what the leading biomechanics labs say, because science, what the top AI researchers say, what pretty much all physiologists say, in biologists, in the sense that the body is a complex dynamical system, and of course neuroscientists, skill acquisition psychologists, complexity scientists, motor learning scientists, mathematicians, because emergence, self-organization, what happens at the edge of chaos. This is not a we don't have the math yet problem, right? And again, before the heat death of the universe, I doubt that any possibility for calculating this will ever emerge. This is about the inherent nature of nature itself. This complexity is not a problem. It is the bliss of motor abundance. This is baked into who and what we are. It is our birthright to be adaptable. But instead of embracing complexity and the emergent nature of our movement systems, we've been fighting with it. We've been fighting nature, trying to, fighting. Oh, get that leg in, get that shoulder in, fighting all the time. Instead of saying, this body is really capable of doing supernatural things. Now again, that does not in any way mean you just say, well, you just do whatever the hell you want, right? We do have a few biomechanics non-negotiables, but they are a very tiny number. And even when we do, it will often be that the training will be, okay, horse or human, do anything but that exact solution that you've been doing. But do anything else. So instead of guiding them to anything that is correct or optimal, which doesn't exist, we want to guide them to any solutions that they can explore, except this one way that they're doing it, even if that was a way that was once deemed correct. We cannot get butterfly effects with linear approaches. So, you're probably all familiar with the term the intermediate blues, where people reach an intermediate level and then, man, do they hit a hard wall, a plateau that is almost impossible to really break out of. They'll feel like, they'll go to a clinic or find a new exercise rate, find a new trainer, get a little better, and then again, plateau. So we understand where that plateau comes from. And when you're following traditional training, you're following a ladder, right? A ladder of success. Step by step, you'll get there. But that's a linear solution to a nonlinear problem. So we think we're climbing a ladder and we just got to keep climbing and it just gets really hard and we're there, but we know if we just get to the next rung and sooner or later, some people will really get to the top if I just worked harder. But we're actually in a maze. And when you're in a maze, if you run into a wall that the goal is right up here, you're close, but you don't know you're in a maze. You don't see the wall, you think you're on a ladder, you think you can get there by just continuing to try right here. But if you are in a maze, there's only one thing that can help you, and that is to explore. And that means doing the one thing that the traditional path really makes difficult for us to even consider, which is you got to go backwards. You got to go sideways. You got to go the opposite direction of where you think the goal is. You got to do the wrong stuff that feels wrong. That is the only way. Fortunately now, we have all these books that talk about how to do it, that have frameworks for skill acquisition. There are huge communities. There's podcasts. There's everything. So to me, this is fabulous news. And it also means that if you have ever been frustrated and thought you were working so hard and yet somehow it just didn't happen for you, and yet it did for other people, it was not your fault. And it was not your trainer's fault. It is the fault of the very foundation, the framework that we all had for 75 years about linear traditional training. This, to me, is the best possible news because it means suddenly there's so many possibilities open. So anyone who has gotten stuck now has a way through that. And it gives us a way to honor individual differences in creativity and expressiveness. And there is so much research. And a lot of it you can find, a huge amount, on Rob Gray's podcast, which I'll talk about in a second. If you can only read 2 books, I recommend these 2, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned and How We Learn to Move. But you should read more. A few other podcasts besides Rob Gray's Perception Action podcast, which is the OG, and also on his pages is where he collects and curates a massive amount of science that is, and he keeps it really up to date. And if you train horses, or you coach equestrians, or you're interested in coach development for any sport, check out the River Tiger podcast from my friend Marianne Davies, who, by the way, is getting her PhD in this, applied to horses and riders together. So how amazing is that? Look for Instagram hashtags, Ecological Dynamics. There should not be a space between ecological and I know it's a hashtag. Okay. EcoD, CLA, self-organization. And if you are a horse person, hashtag stepping stones. And the only way you will know what that actually means is if you read the book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, which you should. And instead of using your expertise to tell people and correct, you're using your exact same expertise to create and design contexts. We call ourselves context designers. We are creating environments and contexts in which things can emerge for the movers, horses or humans. And then individual brilliance can emerge as a side effect of these things that you design and create. If you made it here, thank you. Bye.